Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. On this episode, we're having a discussion about some of the important considerations for a migration away from Microsoft Dynamics GP. I have two guests for this episode. Karen Reardon is Vice President for Sales and Marketing for Menlo Technologies, a global tech services firm with an ERP practice that includes Dynamics GP and SL customers. And Peter Jekyll of Turn On Dynamics joins us once again. Peter's been on several past episodes with me, many of them exploring AX to Dynamics 365 finance and operations upgrades from various angles. Peter and Karen discuss with me some of the common assumptions about a GP to cloud migration, as well as some of the options and considerations that are less frequently discussed. Dynamics 365 Business Central is a good choice for many organizations running GP today, but as Peter and Karen explain, there's no single approach that works for all GP customers. Karen Reardon from Menlo Technologies, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. And Peter Jekyll, welcome back. It's been a little while. Glad to have you back on the podcast as well.
Thanks for not banning me, Jason. Welcome.
Oh, never. Well, never say never, right? But not for today anyway. Great to have both of you here. I'm really interested to have this conversation. You have been putting together some of your thoughts about really where GP and SL customers stand in their sort of upgrade planning right now. They have a lot of factors to think about and a lot of options to consider. You've both come at this from kind of your own history, your own personal histories in the space, but have kind of joined together to think up new strategies and organize your thoughts, I guess you would say, on where these SMB ERP companies should be looking next and how they should approach some of these challenges in terms of what comes next for their ERP strategies. I don't know, Karen, do you want to give a little bit more background on your work in the Microsoft channel, your experience working with SMB ERP customers?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the channel more years than I care to count. I started my career with some of the larger CPA firms back in the day, RSM, Ernst & Young Technology, and whatnot. So have been around the Microsoft ERP space for a very long time. Right now, I work with Menlo Technologies, and we are a acquisitive company, part of the acquisitive family. And we really focus on GP, SL, and a few other products. So, when you talk about, we all approached it differently. So, right, my background is GP and SL. So it was just natural for me to fall into the typical Microsoft story that if you're on GP, the natural migration is for you to go to Business Central. And there's a lot of marketing and material to support that vision. But it was when I talked to Peter and he challenged me a little bit on that is sort of where we kind of came up with this point-counterpoint conversation that it's important for folks like myself who just naturally think Business Central and GP go together, that we really need to expand our vision a little bit and don't necessarily discount the value of perhaps of finance and operations. Wouldn't you say, Peter?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we had such a similar background, from coming from the bigger accounting type of firms, and then working in the industry for a long time, with the Great Plains, and then moving to the Microsoft acquisitions. And that's kind of where our work paths diverged a little bit. I think while I still have a trailing GP business, I branched off to the to the AX D365 F&O world, and so it was really interesting is when we started talking about what should GP customers do, and how that was colored a little bit by our different paths in the the Microsoft world. And like you said, that led to some great conversations about not this is good versus that is bad, as opposed to, how do you take what is the marketing materials and the kind of the generic push of GP to BC being the path, and how do you expand that, with some nuance and some other options where, one size does not fit all here. And there are some, there may be some better, things for people to take a look at. And those are really some fascinating conversations.
Yes. So I will say there was one thing that we both agreed on is that sometimes the right thing for GP customers to do is stay on GP, right? If you need to move to a cloud, there's a hosting options and there's some other ways you can accomplish that. But not necessarily do all GP customers have to migrate to something.
Yeah, and that's a real important point, Jason, and Karen brings up there. If you think about the real cost in owning an ERP system that people forget about, it's not in purchasing the licensing. It's not whether you buy the license or whether you're paying for it monthly. The real cost is the implementation of the software, right? And so there's a lot that goes into that besides time and money. And so just having if you want to go to the cloud, your GP, and you're sitting around saying, hey, let's go to the cloud. If the automatic solution is, well, if you're on GP and you want to be in the cloud, what you should do is go to Business Central. What that does away with the whole thought process that regardless of how easy you're able to make that transition from a cost standpoint and maybe some tools to upgrade things, you're still at the end of the day you're changing to a new ERP system, and there are costs to the organization to that you may not have to incur just because you want to get to the cloud. So maybe the option is you take your in-house GP solution and you take it to one of these great hosting companies, and you've accomplished what you need to do without all the additional costs. And so that's one thing that to me just jumps off at you is the move to the cloud. Does that necessitate the move to BC, or is it done easier by hosting your GP?
Well, let's see. So you guys have covered, you both covered a lot in the last couple of minutes. I mean, a lot of it's clear there's a lot of options, right? There's you mentioned Business Central, you mentioned F&O, and to me, one of the decision points I can imagine is any move to another ERP is going to be a migration, more or less. And Microsoft, for their own sort of strategic interests for themselves, their partners would say, if we can just give our partners a leg up on making it some percent easier, I don't know, 30% easier, let's say, to get to BC than it is to get to any of the other competing ERPs out there, that's enough to kind of capture or retain that GP user base who does want to get off GP, but knows that anything else they go to is going to be essentially a migration. And that's where sort of the investment that they've made, and maybe we could talk about this, but they've made an actual sort of tools that really do make it easier to get to GP to get from GP to Business Central than from GP to anything else. That's what has happened so far. Is that fair? I mean, Karen, I don't know, maybe you've had a chance and your team to get their hands on some of these tools for BC cloud migrations. What are your thoughts there? Is that how it's working out, or is it something else?
Well, certainly Microsoft continues to improve that migration tool. As a matter of fact, the new Wave 1 release gives you the ability to sort of what makes Business Central and GP. One of the things that's very different is Business Central has dimensionalized chart of accounts, of course, and GP is segmented, and how all of that works together. So the new tool actually will take your segments in your chart of accounts and map those over to different dimensions in Business Central. So it becomes a much easier way to go. So yes, the tools are absolutely getting better that Microsoft is providing. But I think what happens sometimes is all we're doing is replicating what we were doing in one system and moving it to the other and missing out on that whole consultative approach of, well, is that really what I want, right? Are those really the best way to, is that the best way for me to get the reporting that I need? Are those the right segments? Is that the way I should do it? So, yeah, it does make it a little bit simpler. But again, that whole idea of just take lift and shift, right? You're losing out on that whole strategy of trying to make it a more improved system. So sometimes I think that gets lost in translation. You still really should have someone kind of help you talk through, is this the right decision? And are we doing it the right way? And is this the right time to make a change?
Why do you think that's getting lost? Is the partner rushing past that element of it, or is the customer looking past it?
I think it's the marketing material that says it's super simple, right?
Okay.
It's really easy to make this happen, and it is, right? I can just say, take this segment and make it this dimension. But what I'm losing is that really right? Has my business changed? And is this the right chart of accounts? Am I doing it the right way? Now, we could all debate best practices, but it's just a really good time to have that conversation before you start the process.
Peter, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so this was a real interesting topic that really highlighted, coming at this from different angles, right? I would say the GP fairly is more of an SMB, and the vast majority of time I spend now is more of on an enterprise side. And so coming at data conversion tools, looking at them completely differently, does give you. It's one of those areas where Kieran and I completely had interesting perspectives on this. Think about this for a second. When I looked at the conversion tools, as a matter of fact, with some new great information over the last couple of days, it's amazing the strides that they've made in that tool. Looks really amazing as far as data conversion tools are. It's great. So I had a friend that was a car mechanic, and we were talking about changing oil back in the day when you can change oil in a car. And there's this thing about the car's got, I don't know exactly, 8 quarts of oil in it, and there's something about making sure you have it all out, and I said, well, what happens if you can only get 7 out, and then you put in 7 clean quarts of oil? And he said, well, if you drain 7 dirty quarts of oil out and add 7 clean, you end up with 8 dirty quarts of oil. And the analogy there is that's what's data. That is what data is like in an ERP system that's been running for any amount of time. So one of the biggest things that we always look at when you're moving or migrating data from one system to another is that whole data cleanup process, right? And changing a chart of accounts to a new system that offers you the ability to be more sophisticated in how you use your chart of accounts, that's not cleaning up data, but that's certainly a great opportunity to take advantage of the new system. So a straightforward pass from one system to the next may not be perfect. Also, that opportunity to clean your data where you have this interim step where you pull everything out into a spreadsheet and tell people, God, knock off the stuff that's old, clean up, the spelling and all these other things that you've wanted to do before. That's a big thing. And then to me, from the AX world, and I imagine this is, less prevalent on the GP side, but everybody in the AX world is modified heavily. And so you can forget about any tools once you have heavy modification. So that's why tools on the enterprise side they don't work as well, and they work better in the SMB space. But again, the key there is that is a very specific case where you can take an upgrade tool and upgrade master files, right? And nobody talks about the fact that there are master files and there are transaction files. And what are you updating? What are you upgrading? Are you able to do custom fields and all this stuff? So it's a more nuanced, more complex conversation. And it especially hits when we talk about GP to BC versus, gee, is this one of those 10, 20, 30% of the Great Plains customers that have expanded their requirements to such an extent that they really should be looking at F&O? But in the world of the Great Plains dealer, right, F&O is a bit invisible. And so in that case, that upgrade tool is going to, take on a totally different life anyways. So again, one of those things, great tool, amazing, stuff, what I've seen, but nuances and things that you need to discuss. And it's, different than you would just read one size fits all, in marketing literature.
Yeah, Peter, GP customers have been using GP for, years and years and years and years and years, for 10, 15 years sometimes. And so when you go in there and you talk to them about, well, let's talk about moving you to Business Central, they're like, well, we don't have any customizations. Everything is just normal, right? It's just standard out of the box. But when you've used an application for 8 years or 10 years, and probably changed staff along the way. You don't even remember all of the little changes in the field name and, oh, I didn't even know that report was custom and things like that. So the good news is GP has been around a long time and there's a lot of people who are using it and very knowledgeable in it. Sometimes the challenge is that when you've used an application for that many years, changes have been made that you don't even remember. And so you got to kind of really dig into that.
Yeah, I've heard that it's very common to have at least, 5 ISV solutions along with GP. A number like that's not unusual.
Yes, that's correct. And, in this new release, there is actually an ISV migration tool. Now, this is new. I haven't had a chance to test every ISV. But again, depending on what ISVs you're using, it's something you want to look at. Does it work in Business Central? Can I migrate? And what's it going to cost me, right? Because you're going from on-premise software where you're paying maintenance to a subscription fee. So, making sure all of the ISVs are, also have subscription pricing so that you know exactly what you're getting yourself into.
I'm getting a bit of an inkling that there are still quite a few ISVs that aren't built for Dynamics 365, especially quite a few on the GP side, but even I think on the NAV side that they're just still very slow to get there. I know there's quite a few that are ready to go and they're in app source and whatnot, but I still hear those complaints from the user base that they still get hung up on that.
Yeah, I know from our perspective, that's very true. And I would only imagine on the AX or F&O, there's even more of that. But so true. I mean, there's, again, I don't even know what the count is, thousands of potential ISV add-ons. So you can imagine there's a handful of those that are not ready. And you know what could be worse, Jason, are the ones who say, we're never going to go there. So now you got to kind of figure it out and, what else you can do to fill that void.
Yeah, and I think there is when you talk about thousands of ISVs, I wonder the number of those that could keep up with the constant release requirements in the F&O world, because that's a completely different world that you're surfing in up there. So if you're an ISV that used to handle have your product cross many platforms, if you're trying to keep up on the F&O side, boy, that's a heavy lift these days, right?
So we've talked about, you've talked about a range of factors that that go into this. I think we've identified some critical ones when a GP customer is planning. There's taking stock of their data quality. There's taking stock of their customizations and their ISV solutions. Whether the processes that they're using within their current ERP should be replicated, or this is an opportunity for them to really re-engineer the way some of their processes work. I don't know what else. I'm thinking of possibly like consolidation of systems. If you're using ERP for one thing and you have third-party systems that you could, I don't know, consolidate. Is that one way to take advantage of an upgrade, or is maybe that a more complicated matter?
Well, Jason, I'll go first and let you then fill in from your point of view. So, one of the things we're trying to avoid is those siloed database. So, chances are your GP is integrated with, or you want to have it integrated with some other applications. So not only ISVs do you have to think about, but am I using an AMS solution? Am I using some sort of reporting tool that I need to migrate? Am I integrated into my manufacturing software? So that whole idea of just lift and shift, let's just run this great migration tool and get over to Business Central, super awesome. And it does a really good job. But that's another area that sometimes we forget to talk about are all of those integrations. And I would imagine most customers have at least one. Maybe it's to your payroll company or HR solution. So just another one of those points. And I'm going to throw another one out that we'll talk about in our next round, Jason, and that's the licensing, right? How do you match up on-premise licensing with cloud licensing? So I'm just put that one out there on the back burners, but we'll stay with this one first. So Jason, what do you think?
You make great points there, and I think that that's certainly one for the future. I mean, I think for any of our listeners, I mean, there are certainly areas we're not going to cover just in this episode, but we're thinking about for future podcast episodes. Pricing and licensing is certainly one. I think other topics around evaluation are probably is probably something we can't get to in real depth right now, but we certainly want to get into more. And just for today's discussion, though, I'm just thinking about maybe what else GP customers need to know about the cloud. I mean, we talked about the idea of putting GP in the cloud. If you're talking about Business Central, maybe we should just clarify this if it's not already assumed. But I can't imagine if you're going to Business Central, most partners will make the assumption and will insist that you're going to Business Central online, right? I mean, there's no again, maybe this is too simple a point, but I can't imagine many partners would even entertain leaving you on premises and moving you to BC. And I don't even think the tools support it, right?
Yeah, I know for us, our story is always if you're going to leave, in this case, GP, you want to go to Business Central in the cloud. That's really where the benefits of the solution are. I know there's a lot of NAV on-premise folks, and Microsoft has some really great tools helping those on-premise NAV users to get to Business Central. Which again, the benefits of the cloud. So, one of the things that is also important to think about is, right, we talk about you move to the cloud, you don't have that upgrade process anymore, how wonderful it will be if you don't have to do upgrades. But typically, Microsoft is scheduled to have 2 releases a year where they're pushing out these new features. Now, in between there's going to be some hot fixes and, database updates and stuff like that. But twice a year, Microsoft is kind of doing those upgrades behind the scenes. And while they are nothing like your on premise upgrade, they do typically require some investment of your time or a partner's time, particularly if you have any customization, if you renamed any fields. Yeah, I like to say that the storyline is everything will upgrade without an issue, but we've all been doing this a pretty long time. The idea that that's going to happen all the time is probably a panacea.
Yeah, and to me, the thing that we've kind of touched on but skated around is that the biggest thing for me is that the the number of customers, in the GP world, and I've run across many of them that have simply outgrown GP from a standpoint of functional requirements, business growth. Something I call the rule of multis. The more of these things that you have, like multi-location, multi-language, multi-companies, right? All these multis that keep adding up. At some point, what you're doing is you're torturing Great Plains to keep up, right? And if you're sitting there in a marketplace with, and again, I'm talking about it, what my understanding of the typical Great Plains, partner ecosystem, because I've been in this forever, is the idea of taking that ultra, sophisticated customer and trying to figure out where to go without looking at the F&O. To me, I think that's the biggest place where a company can make a big mistake, right? Because for whatever reasons are, and there's many, that we can enumerate, F&O has kind of disappeared, or is not in front of mind for a lot of GP partners. A lot of the folks in the GP world, when they picked up an additional product, it wasn't F&O or AX at the time. It was Acumatica or it was NetSuite, right? And so a lot of the thought process for partners is, oh my gosh, this Great Plains isn't a good fit anymore. Let's move them to NetSuite, right? Or let's move them to Acumatica. And that loses those folks outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, right? And there's a lot of reasons why people don't consider F&O from the customer side. And a lot of it has to do is because the partner doesn't introduce it. And why doesn't the partner introduce it? Well, there's a bunch of factors there. But if you're going to buy off on the Microsoft message, right, that Microsoft has all the money in the world, they're the ones that can easily make these ERP packages work with Excel and Outlook and in the cloud. if you're bought off on that message and you're not exploring for maybe 10, 20, 30% of your install base this fantastic opportunity to go on the F&O, that's where the real potential for damage occurs, because you may be making a sideways move for a customer where they really need to be making an upward move to more of an enterprise platform than to a very relatively similar functional package to Great Plains.
Do you have a sense that customers that do fit that profile know that they are candidates for, or that they should be looking beyond Business Central?
And that's an interesting thing. This is an interesting thing that I have found over and over and over, is where the customer knows it, and they know that they've outgrown their Great Plains partner, and they're looking without the partner knowing. And their search field, it's pretty wide. It's the Epicors of the world, right? Those kinds of products. And I have seen so many projects where customers were looking for those kinds of applications, and the GP partner never knew it, because the customer knew that they'd outgrown the partner from a standpoint of where they needed to go as far as an ERP platform. That's a real interesting point, Jason.
I just want to kind of support what Peter was talking about. A lot of times, partners have to be willing to realize that a customer's needs are not in their wheelhouse. And I believe that being able to say, I can't do that, or we don't do that, that's not our expertise, let me turn you on to somebody who has that expertise, carries a whole lot more power and weight in a conversation, and certainly in the mind of your customer. That customer will remember that you didn't try and put a square peg in a round hole. So you have the benefit of that. And then if you find a really good partner to work with, there's always going to be a little bit of give and take. So I do believe that it is the job of a really good partner to recognize what they do well, and maybe some things that they could find another partner to support.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the more nuanced and perhaps difficult elements of this to navigate, I think, as a customer. Well, this has been fun. I think we've really set the stage for a couple of other really interesting topics to dive into. Peter, Karen, thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jason. Good to be here.
Thanks, Jason. See you soon, Peter.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks to Karen Reardon and Peter Jekyll for joining me today. If you want to get in touch by email, reach out to me, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. Also, please be sure to follow us on Twitter @msdynamicsworld. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.